Okay, hi guys. I've seen you guys in the past. It's a pleasure to have you guys again. We can have our election results, at least the initial results within an hour or so, but we've had so many elections in the past 2 years or so that I don't know how many people are still excited about it, but at least you have the right to fulfill your democratic right. And we're all together now, so it's time to talk about the legal status of Jerusalem according to international law, with courtesy of Julia, who gave me the stage to present this to you guys. So I was surprised to see today that this was the only slide I have in English. All the other slides are going to be in Hebrew, so you guys will have a chance to practice your Hebrew and to hear my translation of it. And so I studied the law and international relations at Hebrew University up on Mount Scopus back in 2001 until 2006. I'm a lawyer, but thank God I never practiced it. So I became a tour guide. That's how I got to meet Julia. And I've been unemployed, as you can imagine, for the past 6 years or so. But I'm happy that I have this opportunity. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes, there's something wrong with the connection where it's choppy, but otherwise we can hear you well.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Very good.
And so Jerusalem has always been, if there's one thing worldwide that will connect every human being on the face of the planet, is Jerusalem. If you go to Africa, if you go to Asia, everywhere you go, big, small, whatever, you will always have people knowing what Jerusalem is. And for most people who know what Jerusalem is, it is about the Jew who wandered around this country 2,000 years ago and did certain things that made 2.5 billion people believe in him. His name was Jesus. In fact, his name was Yeshu, but people misread his name and call him Jesus. In any case, his Hebrew name, Yeshu, is his character and his the belief of what he was is what motivates 1/3 of the world population. And that's how Jerusalem became so famous worldwide, because until then it was famous only amongst the Jewish people. 2,000 years ago, Jerusalem started becoming famous worldwide because of what happened in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago to Jesus. And so this will be a main issue in my presentation. We have to keep that in mind, that the legal status of Jerusalem according to international law is how non-Jews, mainly non-Jews, perceive Jerusalem according to their point of view. And their point of view matters. And so the legal status of Jerusalem according to international law is heavily influenced by a Christian perspective of what Jerusalem was or should be, or both. And we're going to address this issue in the upcoming hour. So I'm going to move on to the second slide. And that will be the first. Can you guys hear me well? I don't know if you guys can hear me or not.
כן, אנחנו שומעים אותך טוב, ועכשיו אתה גם בפרזנטיישן מוד, אז זה בכלל טוב.
Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So the title, which can also be seen in English, if smaller, is Palestine under the British Mandate, 1923 to 1948. So let's make a very, very long story short. After World War I, the British and the French have carved out the new Middle East according to the oil winds, and they have created 3 different mandates. The 3 different mandates in the Middle East were 2 British and 1 French. There was the French mandate on Syria that was given to the French by the League of Nations. The French cut off a piece of Syria, which back then was Christian, and named it Lebanon. That's the French mandate on Syria. Then there was the British mandate on Iraq, which came into effect in 1921, and it was called the British mandate on Mesopotamia. We know it today as Iraq. And the third one was the British mandate on Palestine, which included all the holy places for both Judaism and Christianity, and alongside with them Islam, and included the combined land masses of Israel and Jordan and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, minus the Golan Heights of today. And so the British mandate on Palestine is how the British have revived a Roman term from the 2nd century AD following the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans, in which the Romans have won but suffered many casualties, and wanted to punish the Jews by renaming this country after the bitterest enemies of David, the Philistines. Hence, the Romans gave this country the name Palestine for the first time in history, officially. And the British, who, like the Romans, were imperialistic and Western, revived that term in 1922 and basically used the international name of this country throughout history, throughout the past 2,000 years, Palestine. Please bear in mind that the letter P does not exist in Arabic, and therefore Palestine could not have been originally a term in Arabic. The jokes goes in certain parts of the world, including Israel, is that if an Arab wants to pronounce the P, he would say, I do know how to pronounce the P, but I don't know where to put it, because every P would come out as a B in Arabic. And so there's no P in Arabic, just to keep that in mind. In any case, the British have decided that Jews will be allowed to settle only west of the Jordan River. That's the first time in history that the Jordan River became any type of any border. Until then, the Jordan River has never been a border. And the British decided that east of the Jordan River, where historically Jews were living in the past for centuries, if not millennia, Jews this time will not be allowed to settle. Hence, Jews for the past 100 years cannot live in today's Jordan, which back then was initially called the Transjordan Emirates, which was part of the British Mandate on Palestine, yet was controlled by an Arab prince who was originally from Mecca and Medina, called Abdallah, whose great-grandson, he's the current king of Jordan, his name is Abdallah II. Whereas west of the Jordan River, under the same entity, there was no Arab prince controlling anything, but rather direct British rule under a British High Commissioner, the first of whom was a Jew called Herbert Samuel. And there were 6 or 7 of them until the last one departed in 1948, got on that plane that took him to Cyprus and left us in peace. Or in fact, not in peace, but that's a different story. In any case, the British Mandate on Palestine started in 1922 with Jews playing 1/10 of the demographics of that entity west of the Jordan River, where the Arabs were playing a 90% role in these demographics. This is a very important fact that we have to keep in mind, because this will play into one of the approaches towards the legal status of Jerusalem according to international law later in my presentation. And so any person living under the British Mandate on Palestine, never mind who he was or she was, never mind what was their ethnicity, religion, native language, and the like, as long as you have lived legally under the British Mandate on Palestine, you were called by the British Palestinian. This would include my German Jewish grandparents who migrated to Palestine in 1935 on time. Otherwise, someone else would have been giving this presentation right now. And they got a British Empire Palestinian passport. My mom, who was born in 1945, somewhere between Haifa and Tel Aviv, next to Netanya. She still lives there, by the way. She was born when the British Mandate was still in effect. And her birth certificate attests that the British called her Palestinian, because never mind who you were being called Palestinian when you lived under the British Mandate on Palestine legally until their departure in 1948. And so by 1947, when the British were bankrupt after World War II and were about to officially leave the British Mandate on Palestine and give it back to whomever gave it to them to begin with, the League of Nations, which after World War II became the United Nations. By 1947, Jews were up to 1/3 of the population of the British Mandate on Palestine, again, west of the Jordan River, where the Arabs, west of the Jordan River, were constituting 2/3 of the population of any type west of the Jordan River. I'm leaving the eastern part of the Jordan River, what became the Transjordan Emirate, and by 1946 became the Transjordan Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, I'm leaving that aside. I'm only referring to what's west of the Jordan River when I speak of demographics. And in 1947, Arabs were 2/3 and Jews were 1/3. And so this is very important for the next slide. But before I get to 1947 and the United Nations Partition Plan, allow me to translate this title for you. The status quo in the holy places for Christianity in Jerusalem does not appeal to Catholics. Catholics, who always perceive themselves ever since the Crusades to be the keepers, the gatekeepers, the guardians of the holy places of Christendom, now see how at the entrance to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the #1 holy Christian site of any type, anywhere in the world, the entrance has this bell tower that was built by the Catholic Venetians in the 16th century AD. Yet now, because of the 18th century status quo in certain holy places to Christianity in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, now this Catholic bell tower has the flag of neither Switzerland nor England, but rather the flag of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem. This is something that when Catholics see, they first say, what a humiliation that this flag is on our bell tower. And number two, this church should be Catholic. How come it has an Orthodox, Greek Orthodox flag on top of everything? And so this is really important. If you go to the map that I have here on the right, which is division of rights in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you can clearly see that if all the blue is Greek Orthodox and all the green is the Armenian portion of the church, and all the orange is the Franciscan, meaning Catholic portion of the church, you see that Greeks are #1 in the church in terms of possession. You see that Armenians are #2, and you see that Catholics are only #3 amongst the 6 denominations which have any possession, unequal possession in this church. Yet Catholics have always perceived themselves to be those that should be in power in this church. They do acknowledge that the other denominations, who are all Orthodox, by the way, all the other 5 are Orthodox, they do acknowledge that in this place, the church where Jesus, according to their belief, resurrected and basically redeemed humanity from paganism and put them all on the belief on the side of belief in one God. They believe that Catholics should be in charge over this church and others should have minor importance and minor possession in this church. And so the Status Quo Act that started in 1757 and preferred actually the Greek Orthodox and the Armenians over the Catholics was further ratified in 1852 in the Ottoman pre-Crimean War Status Quo Act that was no longer just division of rights between different denominations, but actually became part of Turkish law in 1852. And by 1856, when the Crimean War was over, it was ratified by an international league that signed the treaties that ended the Crimean War and became therefore part of international law. This was further attested in the Berlin Congress of 1878 that ended another war between Russia and Turkey. This further ratified this Status Quo Act and the division of rights in this church to be part of international law. Catholics have never acknowledged this Status Quo Act. They always said that this was a conspiracy between the Turkish rulers and the Greek Orthodox and the Armenians, because there were so many Armenians and Greek Orthodox living under the Ottoman Empire and so few Catholics that the Ottoman Empire had all the reasons why to prefer these two over the Catholics. And this is something that we can never underestimate. This seems like something from the past, something that is archaic, something that no longer plays a role in modern international politics. But this is something that Catholics have in their mind to this day. And when they come, or came until a year ago, to the holiest church on the face of the planet, which is just a half-hour drive from where I live, they actually see this flag to this day, okay, standing on top of what they believe should be theirs. And this is something they really don't like. And therefore, back under the British mandate on Palestine, when the Turks were gone and the Catholics were ascertained that all the interests have now changed, and now the British, who are Westerners, who prefer the Catholics, who are Westerners over the Greeks and the Armenians, the Catholics actually came under Mussolini back in 1940, just before Italy joined the Axis powers, joined Germany against Britain, with a plan to destroy 3/4 of the Christian quarter in the old city of Jerusalem, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to actually knock it down to the ground, including all the markets that are around it, and even some residential areas that are still in place, because this was never fulfilled or was put into any practice, and to build, instead of the original church that I just showed you and that still exists, this unbelievable church that has a mix of all sorts of architectonic styles, but would give 80% of the possession in this church, in this modern church, to the Holy See, to the Catholics, whereas all other 5 denominations combined would only get 20% of what was left, meaning 20% and 80% will be Catholic. This plan had an official name in the registration of the Holy See. The name of it was E42. You can Google it if you like. E42, the plan of the Holy See from the late 1930s, the plan to build a whole new Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This would have been a dramatic move, but the British actually never allowed this to happen. Italy, shortly thereafter, had joined the Axis powers and became an enemy country. And obviously there was no real realization. There was no chance for this plan to ever take place. But during World War II, the Italians and the Germans didn't give up so easily. And Rommel was trying to take the Middle East. And had that happened, surely we would have seen this church being built instead of the original church that is still with us. But thank God, Rommel didn't take the Middle East. Otherwise, you would have had a different tour guide here today, if you know what I mean. And thank God, this church was never built. And that had kept the Catholics after World War II as number 3 in the Holy Sepulchre, like they were before and like they are to this day. Now the title goes different partition plans from 1937 until 1947. Let's go over all of them and see the only thing that they have in common, other than the fact that they all offer different partition in a country for the Jews, a country for the Arabs. But what about this gray area that we see in the middle? And so the Peel Commission, the first one to ever offer, the first one to ever offer partition, that was back in 1937. They actually offered to give this land to a Jewish country, most of the rest to an Arab country. And this area, including a corridor to the city of Jaffa, was going to be in the British-controlled area that was going to include Jerusalem and all the suburbs of it, including Bethlehem, and a corridor to Jaffa in the Mediterranean. Shortly thereafter, once this was rejected by the Arabs, by the way, Ben Gurion preferred to have this one instead of nothing. But eventually the Arabs rejected it, so nothing came out of it. Another partition plan that gave the Arabs even more also included Jerusalem and Bethlehem and the whole corridor to the Mediterranean under neither Jewish rule nor Arab rule, but under an international rule that was going to be, this time, British, like the first one from 1937. After both were rejected and World War II was over, the Anglo-American Conference of 1945 went back to the Peel Commission and actually was about to give the Jews what the Peel Commission was about to give them, whereas the Arabs were going to get roughly the same. Yet the international area has shrunk somewhat and was still including Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and a corridor to the Mediterranean. By 1947, the British have decided to give the mandate that they got from the League of Nations back to the United Nations, that had decided to send here a committee called the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, acronym of which is UNSCOP. The UNSCOM committee was comprised out of 11 members. 8 of the 11 were Christian, including the chairman of the committee, a Swedish judge called Sandstrom, and they all wandered around this country in the heat of July and August, where before cars or buildings had AC units. And that, I believe, is most likely what fried their brains out. Otherwise, I cannot understand how they reached these outrageous recommendations at a time when it was already known that partition was a bad idea, such as the partition of India, which was one of the biggest catastrophes of the 20th century. The United Nations insisted that this country, never mind how small it was, will be divided between a Jewish Palestinian state, shown here in orange, and an Arab Palestinian state, shown here in this yellowish color. Whereas Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and I'm going to zoom in on this one very soon, were going to be neither under the Jews nor under the Arabs, but under a UN-controlled area that was going to be supervised and controlled by the UN, though 100,000 Jews and 100,000 Arabs were living in it. And so in order not to give this to the Jews or to the Arabs, and in order to keep as many Christian holy sites as possible under UN control, the UN Special Committee on Palestine actually suggested, and this was later on ratified, as you will know soon, that this area will be neither Jewish nor Arab. And so what these partition plans have in common is that they all keep these holy Christian sites in the greater Jerusalem area under international control without Jews or Arabs controlling it. And people call this the internationalization of Jerusalem. Now, if you ever heard that term, the internationalization of Jerusalem, you should know that there is a very strong Christian aroma coming out of it. And so Christians have always put Jerusalem at the top of the list of what they wanted to achieve in this area. Other than other types of geopolitics, Jerusalem is so important to these Christian nations that they have always wanted to have some sort of control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Christian holy sites in that area. The United Nations Partition Plan on Palestine was going to give 56% of the land and 80% of the available water of back then to the Jewish country, though Jews were only 1/3 of the population in 1947. Whereas the Arab Palestinian state was going to be founded on 43% of the land and enjoy 20% of the waters in the British Mandate on Palestine, though the Arabs were constituting 2/3 of the population of that entity in 1947. And so the numbers don't add up. You don't give 1/3 most of the assets, whereas 2/3 get proportionally way less. But what is 56 plus 43 make it 99? There's still 1% that we have to address because that's a main theme in our presentation. And that's the 1% that was going to be neither a Jewish Palestinian state nor an Arab Palestinian state. And so if we are going, this is the catastrophic partition of India, which should have given these UN members a clear warning that partition was not going to end very well. And what this has in common with the British partition, with the United Nations partition plan on Palestine, is that the Western mindset back then was that people of different ethnicities, different religions, and different backgrounds and different languages cannot coexist. This is what the United Nations partition plan, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, that's what its members had in mind. And so that was the common mindset of Westerners back after World War II. And the partition in India was catastrophic. The partition on Palestine was most likely going to end catastrophically, but was never put into any effect because a day after it was ratified in the United Nations General Assembly in the city of New York on November 29, 1947, a day after the Israeli-Arab War of Independence had begun in its original stage of Jews versus Arabs from within the British Mandate on Palestine fighting each other, and the British are getting caught in the middle, sometimes literally in the middle. Whereas the second phase of the Israeli War of Independence would start on May 15th, 1948, a day after the British Mandate on Palestine officially came to an end. And that is when 5 different Arab countries would invade the British Mandate on Palestine now that it was obsolete and no longer existed. And they would each try to get a piece of that ex-British Mandate on Palestine, and I will talk about it shortly. Most of them have failed, and by March or April of 1949, 4 of the 5 Arab countries that invaded the recently born state of Israel would sign an armistice treaty with Israel, Jordan, back then Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. And these armistice treaties created the original borders of Israel, or what we call the pre-67 border, or simply the 67 line. And the 67 line, if we go back to this slide here, the 67 line is different than what the UN has offered, because by 1949, we were in control of 78% of what the British Mandate on Palestine west of the Jordan River used to be. And these are the borders of Israel from 49 until 67. But the partition plan was going to give us 56. It's the war and our military achievements that brought us to a situation in which we were in control of 78% rather than 56. And so if we go back to 1947, and the title says the demographics in 1947 is that 2/3 are Arabs, 1/3 are Jews. And therefore the Arab approach is as follows. The British Mandate on Palestine was recognized internationally by the League of Nations. But everything that came after that, the Jordanian annexation of the West Bank, the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem and the like, all of these were never ratified by international law. And therefore the last legal situation in terms of this country that was acknowledged by the international community was the situation in 1947, according to which democracy dictates that all of this should be an Arab state, because most people living in it at the time were Arabs. And that would include Jerusalem, anything around it, and anything from the Lebanese border down to the Egyptian border, and from the Jordan River all the way westward to the Mediterranean. And so the Arab approach regarding the legal status of Jerusalem is based on the fact that after the British Mandate on Palestine ceased to exist, everything that was done after that was considered illegal. And therefore we have to go back to the last internationally acclaimed status of Jerusalem, ratified by the League of Nations, and that goes back to 1947 when they were a majority, and therefore the whole of Palestine, as they call it, should be an Arab state. That is the first approach we're going to address today, whereas the second approach will come shortly. Now the title says, the United Nations General Assembly Partition Plan on Palestine number 181 from November 29, 1947, that has offered the division that was mentioned previously, that was aforementioned just a few minutes ago. We see here that the yellow was going to become a Jewish state. It never said the state of Israel, by the way. That is a term that would come into effect just a year later. And what you see here in pink was going to be an Arab Palestinian state. And there was no name for that entity either. Whereas Jerusalem was going to be UN administrated. And now if we zoom in on this small area, which was only 1% of the entire British Mandate on Palestine west of the Jordan River, we would move to the map on the right that gives us a bigger image of that 1%. And if we know the Christian holy places in and around Jerusalem, we will be able to clearly understand that this map was made by Christians, by a Christian mindset, and was going to leave as many Christian holy sites as possible under a UN administrated area. And that would include not only Jerusalem and all of its famous holy sites, and not only Bethlehem and all of its famous holy sites, but also the neighborhood of En Karem, the traditional birthplace of John the Baptist. And you ask yourself, if En Karem is so far to the west from Jerusalem, why would you have this finger going in here? Because this is where there's another Catholic monastery called John in the Mountains, which is west of the Hadassah Hospital, even west than that. And we have here the Good Samaritan Inn, which is on the way down to Jericho. And Ramallah, which is just to the north of Jerusalem, and is in equal distance from Jerusalem as Bethlehem is. Ramallah is a Christian city in 1947, but doesn't have Christian holy sites. And therefore it was left excluded from that 1%. Whereas Bethlehem, that has both Christian population and Christian holy sites, was included in it. And so we can clearly see, and I could have given you more explanations over why this area and why this area, but I won't bother you guys because I think we all get the picture of how this map was zoned to include as many Christian holy sites as possible. And so the Vatican and the Holy See, for obvious reasons, claim that this map is why Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and anything else you see here in this 1%, that is the legal status of Jerusalem to this day. It should be international, like the General Assembly has ratified back in 1947. And so this is really important because when people talk about the internationalization of Jerusalem, this is mostly what they have in mind. And we have to keep that in mind as well. Now the UN, the title goes, the UN General Assembly decisions has declarative character, but it's not a binding character. Yet the Holy See claims that Jerusalem should be internationalized because if this map is being put into effect, which it never happened, by the way, if this map is being put into any effect, then the Jews and the Arabs will not be able to control all of these Christian holy places. The UN will be in charge. And then the Catholics, through the importance in international politics, would be able to achieve through the UN the change in the status in the holy places in Jerusalem that they so much aspire to achieve. And therefore, it's no wonder that to this day, the Holy See claims that the greater Jerusalem area should be internationalized. And they claimed that also in 1949. And the UN was about to declare the internationalization of Jerusalem. And that's why David Ben-Gurion, only a few days later, in December 1949, has decided to move all the governmental offices from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The internationalization of Jerusalem brought the Israeli government to move to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv in late 1949. And this was because back then there was a fear that they were going to put this into real effect. Today, this is purely theoretical. So many things have changed ever since 1949 that nobody really believes nowadays that there's any chance that this would happen. But back then, in 1949, there was a serious fear lest it would, but it didn't. Now, the interesting part is that the United Nations Partition Plan on Palestine would not have been ratified if it wasn't for the approval, for the support of many Catholic countries that are friends of Israel nowadays. But Catholic dogma until 1965, until what we call Vatican II, would change the Catholic Church completely. But regarding the Jewish nation, the Catholic approach back then was that the Jews do not deserve to have their own country for a number of different reasons. And so how come Catholic countries back in 1947 would actually acknowledge and support the creation of a Jewish country? Most likely because all of these countries which supported the partition plan, that most of which were actually Western countries or South American countries, were not so much interested in a Jewish state or an Arab state, but rather to keep as many Christian holy sites as possible under neither Jewish nor Arab control. And so all of these South American countries that wanted to deprive us from having Jerusalem and to make it international, later on got streets in Jerusalem that are named after them. Because in the first neighborhood built in Jerusalem after the War of Independence, neighborhood called Kiryat HaYovel, which is not far away from the Hadassah Hospital, by the way, we named so many streets after the countries that have supported the partition plan of 1947, forgetting that the partition plan was going to deprive us from having Jerusalem, including the very area where this neighborhood was built. And what the title says, and we still don't get it, because these streets have these names to this day. And what we don't get is that the UN wanted to take Jerusalem away from us. And these Catholic countries were going to take Jerusalem away from us and deprive us from having Jerusalem. And we still don't get it. And I suggest to change all these street names and give them new names. In any case, the word internationalization has a very, very particular aroma. And therefore, the UN and the Holy See share the internationalization approach of Jerusalem. And that's why when the Pope comes here, like he does every 5 years by now, and this is the last papal visit in this country back from 2014, you see the Pope here in the Western Wall, something that American presidents would never dare to do while executing their role as presidents. We see here the Pope going up the Temple Mount with members of the Jordanian royalty and of the Palestinian entity that is in charge over administration in the Temple Mount. And we see the Pope also in Bethlehem. The Bethlehem is not part of East Jerusalem or West Jerusalem, as you would know soon. The Temple Mount, you could say it's East Jerusalem. The Western Wall is East Jerusalem, but the Pope has also been to Yad Vashem, to the Holocaust Museum, which is in West Jerusalem, because for the Holy See, everything in that 1% should be internationalized, and therefore the Pope has no problem visiting all of them, whereas American presidents and other presidents have a very different approach. And so if we move further, we see that in June 1948, another Swedish representative of the UN, Count Folke Bernadotte, tries to appease the Arabs. But even when he offers to amend the partition plan in favor of the Arabs, even then Jerusalem stays international. But even when he's willing to give the Arabs way more, Jerusalem stays international. And later on, he got assassinated in what was the first political assassination in Israel's history by members of the Stern Gang that shot his brains out in September of 1948 in modern Jerusalem, back then in the heat of the War of Independence. With his death, his recommendations came to an end, and this also was never put into any practice. He was succeeded by his second in command, Ralph Bunche, an African American who would put Israel and these 4 Arab countries around the table in the island of Rhodes, Greece, and they would sign 4 different armistice treaties that took the position of the troops on the ground in 1949 and actually froze them. It happened to be that Israel was in control militarily of 78% of what the British mandate on Palestine west of the Jordan River used to be. Whereas the remaining 22%, and everybody living in these 78% became Israelis, including my mom, who was 4 years old at the time. She hasn't changed much at the age of 4, but what did change was who was now governing her life. So from a Palestinian, she became an Israeli overnight, because now there was a new entity with a new name controlling her life, the State of Israel. That would include all the Arabs who found themselves living in Israel after 1948. How do you call them? Israeli Arabs. And they are not Palestinians. They were Palestinians until 1948, like my mom. But now they lived under Israel, and therefore they became Israelis. Those living in the remaining 22% were only Arabs, who previously were Palestinians, but now lived under two countries that never gave them statehood, and therefore there was no new name to give them. For lack of a better option, everybody kept on calling these Arabs in the 22% that didn't become Israel, according to the last official name that the British gave them, Palestinians. So the term Palestinian got shrunk in 1949 from everybody living in this area to just Arabs and just those who lived in the 22% that didn't become the state of Israel in the War of Independence. And so the differences between what the UN offered in 1947 and what the Jewish state, okay, and how the Jewish state was founded in 1949 show us a 22% difference, because the UN was going to give the Jews a state on 56% of the land, whereas the military achievements brought us to have control over 78%, and the partition plan, and the armistice treaties with these countries basically perpetuated that situation. Jordan, back then, the Trans-Jordan Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, was in charge, not legally, but they took possession militarily over these 2,200 square miles that later on they will annex illegally and call it the West Bank, because Jordan itself is the East Bank. Therefore, Jordan now called this the West Bank, now that it became part of their country. Now, until then, until 1949, whatever was east of the Jordan River was called the Trans-Jordan Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. But now that Jordan was in control over the two sides of the Jordan River, there was no longer any point in naming this country after Trans-Jordan, after just one side. Therefore, the annexation of the West Bank, which is a Jordanian term, is the same point in time in which Transjordan changed its name into Jordan, because now it was in control over two sides, over the two sides of the Jordan River and not just one side. So the West Bank is a Jordanian term, whereas the Gaza Strip is an Egyptian term. The Egyptians took a small strip of land that they conquered militarily around the city of Gaza and named it the Gaza Strip. Yet the Egyptians have never annexed the Gaza Strip and never gave the Palestinians there any rights to any passport, residency, or the like, whereas the Jordanians did annex, though illegally, this area and gave the Palestinians in here the right to enjoy a Palestinian passport, a Jordanian passport, or a Jordanian residency. But the world kept on calling all the Arabs in these two areas Palestinians, because there was no new name to give them. Now, if we move to the divided Jerusalem between 1949 and 1967, it says divided Jerusalem, a total of 44 square kilometers. That will be around 16 square miles. And even all of these areas combined that you see here marked in this yellow line or orange line, all of that is still way smaller. I'm sorry, all of this that I'm now showing with the pointer is how big Jerusalem was between 1949 and 1967. This was the size of it also before the British have departed. But what you see here in orange is what the UN has offered as the 1% that was going to be neither Jewish nor Arab. And so the corpus separatum, the separate body, that 1% that was going to be internationalized, was going to be way bigger than all of Jerusalem, Israeli and Jordanian combined. And in fact, it was going to be like 5 or 6 times bigger. Now Jerusalem was de facto divided between Israel and Jordan in a way that Israel was in possession of 38 square kilometers, whereas Jordan was in possession of only 6. one of these 6 square kilometers is the 1 square kilometer of the old city. Here it is. And so this is the Jordanian Jerusalem. That's it. Very small. This is the Israeli Jerusalem. Please remember, I'm not calling the Jordanian Jerusalem East Jerusalem. And I'm not calling the Israeli Jerusalem West Jerusalem. These are terms that would come into effect only after 1967. And Jerusalem until then was divided between 2 countries that have kept this border area relatively quiet for a number of different reasons. But the combined landmass of both in Jerusalem was only 44 square kilometers. That's not very big. In 1960s, how do you call the Arabs living in these 6 square kilometers that belonged to Jordan back then? You call them Palestinians. Did they have the right to have a Jordanian passport? Yes. Did all of them got the Jordanian passport prior to 1967? Not all of them. They didn't have to take the passport. They had the possibility. They had the right to get it. In any case, Jerusalem was now divided prior to 1967, and the Jordanian portion was really small, and the Israeli portion was bigger, but not as nearly as big as what the UN was offering in the partition plan. Now, please note that all the Christian holy sites in the old city of Jerusalem were under Jordan until 1967. There are so many Arab villages around the Jordanian Jerusalem that were part of the West Bank, but Jordan never allowed these Arab villages to become part of the Jordanian Jerusalem. They were in the West Bank, but they were not part of the Jordanian Jerusalem portion of the West Bank. And if we move to the next slide, we see the pre-67 borderline. This is a nun from a monastery that is right on the seam line between Israel and Jordan. She had her dentals falling into the no man's land between the 2 areas, and they had to call the UN to take the nun and to go after her dentals, and they found it. It's a very famous picture from the early 1960s. We can see here the no man's land between Jordan and Israel. We see the old city. We see the Israeli enclave up on Mount Scopus, demilitarized zone. And we see the no man's land around the UN headquarters that are still there and are, in fact, the only reminder of any UN presence in Jerusalem to this day. Today we call it the Goldman or the Cherubim or the Haas Promenade, which is right next to that UN headquarters building, which was originally the British High Commissioner to Palestine Palace. Then the Jordanians have attacked that UN building in 1967. This was the kickstart of the 6-day war in the Jordanian front. And that was the time for Israel to retaliate and out of the right of self-defense. And according to international law, whatever you achieve while exerting your right for self-defense and you conquer while doing so is legally, at least partially, okay, under your control, legally. Now that is, of course, until there's some peace treaty in the future that will determine otherwise or will accept it. But as long as there's nothing final, you can actually claim that area taken while exerting your right for self-defense to be legally part of your country. And therefore, the Israeli approach regarding East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem is very simple. We took the Israeli portion of Jerusalem in 1948, while after being attacked by local Arabs and Arabs coming from other countries. And therefore, our right for the Jerusalem portion prior to 1967 that was under Israel is legal because we took that area by doing self-defense. In 1967, we used the exact same reasoning to justify our control over parts of Jerusalem that are east of what we had until 1967. And what these parts are basically different than what the small Jerusalem of Jordan used to be. Because in 1967, here it says Jerusalem before and after 1967, Israeli approach. We have acquired legal rights over both areas, West and East Jerusalem, because both of them were taken while exerting our right for self-defense. And so if you look at that small area, if you look at that blue area, that is what Jerusalem was in Israel prior to 1967, and some additions that we added after that. These additions have nothing political related to them because they were never part of Jordan to begin with. After the Six-Day War, Israel had decided not to only annex the 6 square kilometers that were part of the Jordanian Jerusalem, but 64 more square kilometers on top of these 6, meaning a total of 70 square kilometers that were now officially being called East Jerusalem, though some of them are north of Jerusalem and some of them are south of Jerusalem, not just to the east of it. And so the term East Jerusalem is a political term. It's not necessarily just a geographical term. And East Jerusalem is a term referring to the 70 square kilometers out of the 5,500 square kilometers of the West Bank that Israel did annex after 1967, and after taking it from Jordan, while exerting our right for self-defense. It is 1% of the West Bank that Israel made into what we call East Jerusalem. Now, has any country recognized actually the Israeli control of East Jerusalem to be legit? No. Has any country recognized the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem to be legal? No. How many countries have recognized the Jordanian annexation of the West Bank? Just 2, Britain and Pakistan. How many of them have recognized the Jordanian annexation of the Jerusalem portion of the West Bank? Just Pakistan. It means that if you look at things in perspective of international law, neither the Jordanian annexation of the entire West Bank nor the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem are considered legal in the eyes of international law. We claim that because we took certain areas in self-defense in 48 and other areas in self-defense in 67, that both West Jerusalem marked in blue and East Jerusalem marked in green are officially part of Israel because we took them as part of a legal right that came into being because we were attacked and then retaliated by doing self-defense. And therefore, that's the Israeli approach. So far, we have mentioned the Arab approach, that the entire area west of the Jordan River should be all one big Arab country. The second approach is that of the Holy See and the UN, that the 1% of the British mandate on Palestine that was going to be internationalized should become internationalized. And that is the second approach. The third approach is the Israeli approach. This Israeli approach is that we were attacked, we retaliated, we took areas in 2 different time frames, and now whatever we took and annexed is ours. The remaining 99% of the West Bank that we have never officially annexed, though some people are talking about it, this is a major theme in the upcoming elections. But by now, after 51 years, Israel has yet to annex the remaining 99% of the West Bank. And therefore, nobody claims that we have full legal right over the remaining 99%, but we do claim that we have a legal right over the 1% of the West Bank that we did annex. It is East Jerusalem. And if we move forward, we see that even if you combine the much bigger areas of post-67, West and East Jerusalem combined, you still get to 110 square kilometers, which is still much smaller than the corpus separatum, the separate body that was offered by the UN to be internationalized in 1947, but that has never happened. It was never put into any effect. And so if we move over to the next slide, East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank. And we see here that Jewish settlements in the West Bank are all over the place. And if we look at what we see here in orange and yellow, we see areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority. These areas combined constitute 40% of the entire landmass called politically the West Bank. Add to that 1% of the West Bank called East Jerusalem, and you get to 41. What's the balance? 59. 59% of the West Bank is what we call areas C, administered by Israel, though some Palestinians living in them. And you would find all settlements in area C. The international community would call the Jews living in East Jerusalem also settlers, same like Jews living anywhere else, everywhere else in the West Bank. So the world calls any Jew, any Israeli living in the West Bank a settler, whether he lives in Zone C or in East Jerusalem. And that is something that the people in Israel are not so much aware of. Here we get to a slide in English. It's very nice. And so these resolutions do have a binding power. I'm talking about the Security Council resolutions regarding this country, because it is part of Article 7 of the UN Charter, which deals with Security Council resolutions. Remember, the partition plan was a General Assembly resolution, and therefore it doesn't have a binding character. However, it remains unclear as to what the word territories mean. The British version says territories. Israel should pull back from territories taken during the war. The French version says Israel should pull back from the territories taken during the war. And that is, as you understand, a major difference. Both resolutions mention the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, clearly denying the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem, but probably not in regard to West Jerusalem, because West Jerusalem was Israeli starting in 1948, whereas these resolutions were made after 1967 and after 1973. So they probably refer to our achievements in the Six-Day War, not so much to our achievements in the War of Independence. In any case, the approach of Western countries and moderate Arab countries is that West Jerusalem is de facto the capital of Israel. We see here, for example, Anwar Sadat back in 1977 addressing the Israeli parliament, which is in West Jerusalem. So if he does that, he must be acknowledging West Jerusalem to be capital of Israel, though he never said that officially. We see here Bill Clinton attending Yitzhak Rabin's funeral back in 1995 on Mount Herzl, which is next to the Holocaust Museum. That would be in West Jerusalem. And we see here Angela Merkel sitting in the PM's office in West Jerusalem, and she was addressing the Israeli parliament, and she was going to Yad Vashem, and any important leader who comes to Israel stays at the King David Hotel, which is in West Jerusalem, has dinner with Netanyahu in his prime minister's residence, and with the Israeli president in his residence. And basically, they all acknowledge West Jerusalem to be capital of Israel, though they have never stated that officially. The first one to actually state that officially was Donald Trump, now just a few years ago, and we'll talk about it shortly. In any case, the American approach is that presidential visits, official presidential visits, can only take place in West Jerusalem. How come we see Obama in here touching the Western Wall, which is in East Jerusalem? Well, he did that 2 months before he was first elected president of the United States. This means that he was just, quote unquote, a senator back then. But 5 years later, when he returned to Jerusalem as president, he was taken on a tour at the Israel Museum. This is the Shrine of the Book and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Shrine of the Book is in West Jerusalem, whereas the Western Wall is in East Jerusalem. How come he came here and later on he came there? Because back then he was not a president, and here he is already executing his power as president and acknowledges Israel's rule over West Jerusalem without visiting the Western Wall again as president. If we go further left, we see the next American president who came on a visit. His name is Donald Trump. He's no longer president, but when he came here, and I think it was 2017. And when he did, he was dividing his visit into 2 different visits. The original visit was only in West Jerusalem. So he was going to the Holocaust Museum and he had dinner, he addressed the parliament and the like. Yet the part of his visit that was in the old city of Jerusalem and included the Holy Sepulchre and the Western Wall, that part was considered and categorized as a private visit and included no Israeli bodyguards or any Israeli police or security personnel alongside the American personnel that escorted Trump into these areas. And so this is very important. Even Trump, who was the biggest supporter of Israel's claim to Jerusalem, has moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and the like. Even Trump did not want to make any move that would be considered as recognition of the United States in Israel's control over East Jerusalem, and only acknowledge Israel's control over West Jerusalem, has moved the embassy to West Jerusalem and not to East Jerusalem and the like. And so the United States, the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995 was vetoed by every presiding US president ever since it was enacted by the Congress. We see here Harry Truman getting a gift from Ben-Gurion and Abba Eban. That was back in the early 50s, right after the foundation of the State of Israel. But Truman, who was a staunch supporter of the State of Israel and was the first human in 1948 to acknowledge and to recognize the newborn State of Israel, Truman would not move the embassy to Jerusalem. This is the plot of land in West Jerusalem called, along a street called Hebron's Road. That plot of land is empty to this day. I took that picture when I made this presentation a few years ago, and that plot of land is still empty because it was designated to be the United States embassy in Jerusalem, according to the United States Congress Embassy Act, Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995. But that was never put into any effect until Donald Trump came into power back in 2016, and Donald Trump has decided to take the already existing United States consulate in Jerusalem and change its name and its role into an embassy. These flags were all over the place until Donald Trump stopped being a president and was replaced by Joe Biden. And if you go to that roundabout, to that traffic circle, right next to the entrance to the United States Embassy, you will still have the sign, this is the United States Embassy, but none of these flags are still in place. I think there's a reason for that. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just getting it wrong. But in any case, these are divisions, possible divisions of the Temple Mount. But if I want to actually summarize everything, there are different approaches over the legal status of Jerusalem according to international law. And I'm not talking about Israeli law. I'm not talking about American law. I'm not talking about Jordanian law. I'm only referring to international law. The Arab approach is that everything in this country should be Arab state. The Israeli approach is that the Jerusalem, both West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, are legally part of the state of Israel because we have acquired control over these areas while exerting our right for self-defense. The UN and Holy See's approach is that the corpus separatum, the 1% that should have been internationalized, should still be internationalized, and neither Jews nor Arabs should be in charge of it, in charge over these areas. Whereas the last approach, that of Western countries and moderate Arab countries, is that West Jerusalem is de facto capital of Israel, though we don't say that officially. Whereas East Jerusalem will be determined, the status of East Jerusalem would one day be determined whenever we have a peace treaty one day, God's willing, and then people will decide what's the legal status of East Jerusalem and how Jerusalem will be divided. But by then, there are a lot of things that could happen, and the results of the elections that are being published as we speak may have some effect on that. That would be the time now to allow you guys to ask questions.
Gil, toda rabba. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. It's like even for me, I think I know most of the facts, and even then, your presentation was wonderful. Thank you for that. We have quite a few questions here over the chat, so I will start reading, and people will probably start writing more questions, and that will proceed. Well, yes. The elections just finished like 4 minutes ago. So no more votes, and we will get the preliminary results published as we speak, as you said. Whew. So, well, let's see. Okay, we have some comments here. Likud is still ahead. Gantz did very bad. Lowest turnout since 2009. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Well, so we let's start. Where are we? I read that the Israeli. Okay, no, this is not a question yet. Okay, I don't actually see questions. I do see people saying things, but.
I see a question.
Okay. You do see a question, so maybe, okay, all right. A question from Gail. Have Muslims asked for Muslim holy site around the world to be internationalized? Have Buddhists insisted Buddha's holy sites be internationalized? If not, then why are Christians then asking for their sites to be internationalized? Oh, this is a question. Gil?
Sure. That's a good question. And the answer is that these specific holy Christian sites are not under Christian control. And Christians were always afraid lest something would happen. And that they had rights. They had good reasons to be afraid over what will happen to these Christian holy sites. Because there were some bad examples from the past. But if you have something that you cherish so much, like the belief in Jesus and the will to be to have the right to even access these areas, and you have the fear that lest it would not happen, then you would want to control over these areas to be in the hands of those that will allow you to visit these sites and to pray in them and the like. And so, and possibly even to change the status quo in these holy sites, like the Holy See was trying for decades, in your favor, at the expense of other Christians. But in any case, neither Greek Orthodox, nor Armenians, nor Catholics were in control of these holy sites ever since the Crusades, pretty much, ever since the 13th century. And the United Nations Partition Plan was going to give them, to open for them a window to have the influence being felt in these Christian holy sites, but that didn't happen. Muslims asked for Muslim holy sites around the world to be internationalized. Well, all the holy Muslim sites are under Muslim control. So that question is theoretical. They have Buddhists insisted Buddha's holy sites be internationalized. I don't know, but that is not so much part of this part of the planet. All the Jewish holy sites, by the way, right? Here's a good answer. Not all Jewish holy sites were, until 1967, under Israeli control. They were mostly under Jordanian control, including the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, which before it became a Muslim holy site was a Jewish holy site, still is. And so Christians were never in charge ever since the Crusades over this country. And the British were Protestants, so that is, they've had no representation in these Christian holy sites whatsoever. To this day, they don't have any representation in these Christian holy sites. And therefore, the countries that were keen to allow its citizens to visit these sites wanted these sites to be neither Jewish nor Arab, but rather internationalized. And then people would have access, and reality on the ground was going to possibly change had that happened. But it didn't happen.
Okay. There is a question from Harry. When do you see normalization with most Arab countries, if at all, including having embassies in Jerusalem? Is it more of a matter of inter-Arab politics or business self-interest?
I cannot answer the latter portion of the question. I can address the first portion. Normalization. I would say that most Arab countries, moderate ones, those that have peace treaties, or I would say those are not in a state of war with Israel, like Tunisia, Morocco, and the like, even though they don't state that officially or publicly. Whether they have the embassy in Jerusalem or not, that doesn't matter that much. In the consulates that many countries have in Jerusalem, rather than in the embassies that most of them have in Tel Aviv. We keep on calling it the consulate, it doesn't really matter. What Trump did was to try to be the first to put the embassy in Jerusalem. But what he did basically was just the legal right that the president has, or the obligation that the president has to fulfill a Congress act that all American presidents were vetoing until 2018, until Trump came into power, and he simply didn't sign that paper. And so having embassies in Jerusalem or not, that is not the key issue. The key issue is what you do all through the year, not just embassy-wise. And if you stay at the King David Hotel and if you go to the Holocaust Museum and you have dinner with the Prime Minister in his residence, and if you have dinner with the President in his residence, and if you go to Mount Herzl and if you go to the Shrine of the Book, all that you do shows that you acknowledge West Jerusalem to be capital of Israel. And so if you have an embassy there or not, doesn't matter. Normalization with most Arab countries, we already have normalization with most Arab countries. Just in the past year, Israel has signed 4 different peace treaties with countries that we never dreamt to ever go to. And the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, of all places, which was on the blacklist of the CIA, not just until a year ago, to be a terrorism supporting country, and not so long ago also Morocco. And so normalization with most Arab countries is already in the making, also because there's a joint enemy between Israel and these Arab countries, and that joint enemy is called a common enemy called Iran. Okay, and they are afraid of Iran even more than we are afraid of Iran, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure we have peace treaty with most Arab countries, but we do have with a few, which is great. And Morocco would be visited long ago. But okay, but we are on the right way. Question by Alvin. This is a philosophical one, I guess. There are 150 to 200 territorial disputes around the world. Why is Israel's territorial dispute the only one always under the microscope?
That's a question that any tour guide in Israel would like, I think, to answer. Right, Julia? So, there are so many territorial disputes around the world, but Israel has always been the bridge between 3 continents. Ever since biblical times, this is a country where the birds would migrate from Asia to Africa, from Europe to Africa, and vice versa. This is the part of the planet that humans were always eager to visit. They were always eager to know about. This is the cradle of Judaism. This is the cradle of Christianity. It has the 3rd holiest place in Islam. There are few places on the face of the planet that interest people more than Israel, being honest and modest at the same time, which is not so easy for Israelis to be, but I do my best. And in any case, this is also the country where Jesus was born and did his ministry. Now, whether we believe in him or not, that doesn't matter. Because what does matter is that there are 2.5 billion Christians who are all eager to come to this country, and are very much interested to know about it, even if they never make it here. Because this is the country where for them, okay, or for most of them, everything began. It has all begun. And so another issue is that Israel has always played and still plays to this role, a major, major role in international geopolitics. We're a very small country and we are a very old nation. People come to me and told me, people came to me until Corona erupted. People came and told me all the time, Gil, in 1948, when the Jewish nation was born, and I tell them, stop it right there. Let's rephrase. In 1948, when the state of Israel was born, and 3,200 years ago, now Passover is a few days away, right? 3,200 years ago, when the Jewish nation was born, now you can continue asking your question. And so what happens is that Israel in this country has always been in the core of international geopolitics. Even when the Jewish people were scattered in diaspora, world powers were interested in what was going on here because of the Christian connotation of this country that was in effect even when most Jews were not living in here. And so there was never shortage of reasons for people to be interested in what's going on in this country. And CNN that gives you the same news 10 times every minute or every hour simply enhances that already existing situation.
Yeah, the bottom line is that we are simply more interesting. We are more fascinating. We are more different. We are more special. We are the belly button of the universe. You know, there is, you guys, you Jews, well, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest of the holy Gil was talking about, there is an actual spot which is considered to be the belly button of the universe. So, you know, being all surrounding this belly button, we must be the focus of CNN and Fox News and, you know, all other sorts of international news. Okay.
There's another comment I would like to add to what Yula had just said. Most tourists coming to Israel come to Israel because of something that comes out of their heart. Most people coming to Israel do so because of ideological reasons. If it's a bar mitzvah ceremony or bar mitzvah trip, this is called ideological because you do it for a certain reason that has to do with religion, that has to do with something that is considered to be culture, ideology. And the visitor brings with him his culture to a country that accepts his culture. If Christians are coming to Israel as pilgrims, that is done because of ideology. It comes because of morals. It comes because of values. This is not so much the case when people are going on a trip to Western countries where the food is great and the wine is great and everything is great and the views are spectacular and you can go out at night, but there's nothing that ideological that brings them to these countries. And that is something that we have to keep in mind. Most visitors to Israel come here because of ideological reasons. Other questions?
Well, right now we are done with questions.
Joel is raising his hand.
Okay, go ahead.
But he's muted. Oh.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, since we have no more questions on chat, so you're welcome to unmute yourself and just talk. And if you want to go to other occupations, so thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for your donations and support. And again, I apologize so much for keeping you waiting for so long, but I hope it was worth it. So thank you, Gil. And yeah.
Thank you.
Gil, I have a question. Gil, I have a question.
Please.
The tourism, let's say that was in the last, when it was open, how would you break the tourists down by religion? Christian versus Muslim versus Jewish, whatever.
We had Muslim tourists coming to Israel. Needless to say, we've had Jewish tourists coming to Israel. But there's no doubt that for the past 1,700 years, the major bulk of tourists coming to Israel is Christian. I think that out of the organized tourism,
Yeah.
people who come on organized trips, I think that if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around 75% of organized tourism to Israel was Christian.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It should not be so. Go ahead. Go ahead.
What is Jordan's position on annexation of, say, the West Bank? Israel's annexation.
Well, allow me to remind you, Jordan is the country that annexed the area that they named the West Bank.
Right.
And almost no country has recognized that annexation back in 1950 to be legit. We came in 1967. We took an area that internationally was taken by Jordan illegally, and we took 1.2% of it, and we also illegally, according to international law, annexed that small area, and no country has recognized it, not even one. Jordan's approach regarding Israel's role, Israel's control over East Jerusalem, is the same approach like Western countries and moderate Arab countries. I mean, when King Hussein came here, he was attending, and he was in that picture that I showed you, he was attending Rabin's funeral on Mount Herzl, which is in West Jerusalem. So if he was there on an official ceremony, governmental ceremony, it means that he is recognizing Israel's control over West Jerusalem, but he would never go on an official visit to East Jerusalem while being on an official visit to Israel.
Got it. Thank you. I thought it was an excellent presentation.
Thank you very
I'd
much.
like to say something about going to Israel. I didn't go for religious reason or ideological reason, just curiosity about this ancient land of such an importance for the whole world. Just curiosity, nothing else. And I learned a lot.
Yeah, a lot of people come. Yeah, a lot of people come because of that. It's on the news all the time, and it's the country of the Bible, and it's a very interesting country regardless. So when everything is over, just come, guys.
I remember the sniper walls being up on Jaffa Road, where it's a clear shot to the old city wall. I think you know that section of Jaffa Road.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to go back to that. People in Israel, people around the world, many Jews too, never knew what it was before 1967, where you had to keep your head down. And it's a blessing that we have it, and we're going to keep it. And if people don't like it, as they say in the United States, just get a life. But thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great job today. Thank you so much for revisiting us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
What is the content of your next presentation?
Thank you.
What's that?
What will be the content of your next presentation?
Whatever Yulia would tell me to do.
Okay, we will discuss that later, Gil, and I will discuss it with you, Steve. But yeah, something which has to do with geography and politics and history and law and international opinion, something like that. All right. Gil, תודה רבה שוב, and again, I apologize for my mistake.
לילה טוב.
לילה טוב.
לילה טוב. Thank you, guys.
לילה טוב. Ladies and gentlemen, so once again, thank you so much for being patient and participating and, whatever happened today. And I really hope that it was worth it. And the fact that you've stayed for 2 hours or so means that it was worth it for a way. So I hope to see you again the day after tomorrow. No time mistakes, promise. Yeah, the day after tomorrow, as you already know, we have a tour of Akko, which is one of the most diverse, fascinating, beautiful, polluted though difficult holy, special, historical places in Israel. Okay, that used to be a port, the main port of the Holy Land for like 4,000 years or so. I know that it's not correct, Gil. Yeah, I know, but that's like roughly. And it is an amazing destination. And you're welcome to join me on the virtual tour the day after tomorrow in Akko, a full tour of just Akko. And next week,